A dog dug a hole every day. The reason is heartbreaking. The first time I saw the old golden retriever digging a hole, I froze mid-step on the sidewalk. Something about the frantic scrape of paws against sun-baked earth stopped me cold. I thought I'd witnessed every kind of oddity in our tiny, close-knit town, like the elderly man who fed crows at sunrise or the teenager who spoke to the street lamps. But never before had a dog captured my attention so fully. There was something desperate, almost feverish in the way she panted, jaw trembling with exertion, as if her very life depended on hollowing out that patch of dirt. The day was blazing hot, cicadas screaming, the sun's heat pressing down so relentlessly that most creatures sought shade. Yet there she was, digging. Dust rose around her in a cloud, coating her golden fur with a dull, brownish film. She kept at it until her paws bled. People paused to watch, some took photos, others murmured in confusion, but no one stepped forward to stop her. It was as though we collectively understood we were bearing witness to something private, something heartbreakingly urgent, and had no right to interfere. By sundown, she was gone, leaving behind a gaping hole that looked unsettlingly like a small grave. The next day, the dog returned. No one knew where she came from, but again, I found her near the same spot, frantically digging, tossing up clumps of earth and rocks with single-minded devotion. This time, a small crowd gathered at a distance. They pointed, whispered theories, rabies, hidden treasure, a bizarre dog habit. A few daring souls crept close enough to see if she wore a collar or a tag, but all found was a tattered red around her neck, frayed at the edges and nearly indistinguishable beneath the dirt. She was smaller up close than I'd imagined, her ribs faintly visible through her golden coat, flecked with a few white hairs around her muzzle suggesting she wasn't young. Her eyes glistened with some deep, unfathomable emotion, as if the act of digging released all her fear and sorrow. When she finally stopped, panting so heavily I worried she might collapse, she licked her bloodied paws and stared into the distance with an intensity that made my chest tighten. It felt as if she was searching for something beyond our comprehension, as if she saw a ghost that we couldn't see. Word spread fast. Our town thrived on gossip, and by the third day, half the neighborhood knew about the dog and her strange ritual. Children on bikes would follow her at a distance, entranced by her singular routine. Some tried to give her water or scraps of food. She would lap up the water thirstily, nibble at the food, but the moment her thirst and hunger were sated, she'd trot back to that bare patch of land and continue digging. Even when dusk fell, she refused to leave until she dug as deep as her body would allow. Then, with a small whimper, she'd trudge away, presumably to find a place to sleep. No one seemed to know where she spent the night. Each morning she'd be back, and each day, the hole grew wider, the pit deepening into the kind of trench you might see in old wartime footage. It wasn't just the digging itself that tugged at our hearts. It was the look in her eyes, a shimmering heartbreak, a desperate plea. She wasn't simply digging at random. She was searching for something precious, or burying something too heavy for her to carry alone. I couldn't stand it any longer. On the fifth day, I decided I had to do more than just watch. I approached her gingerly, my palms raised in a gesture of peace, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. She paused, ears back, body trembling, torn between fear and the drive that compelled her to keep going. I crouched low, speaking in the softest voice I could manage. "Hey there, sweet girl, what are you looking for?" I didn't expect a response, of course, but part of me hoped for a sign, a wag, a tilt of her head. Instead, she let out the saddest whine I'd ever heard, as if the entire world's sorrow was contained in her tiny chest. Then she resumed digging. It didn't take me long to realize that this dog had no caretaker. She seemed to appear from nowhere at first light, but if she had a home, no one in town seemed to know about it. I watched her more closely over the next few days, trying to piece together any clue. I noticed that sometimes, at the very end of her digging, she'd pause, nose snuffling at the loose dirt, before giving the ground an almost loving nudge. Like she was placing something there. or maybe paying tribute to something lost. The curiosity gnawed at me, and soon I was talking to everyone. The local mailman who walked the same route daily, the florist who set up a stand on the corner, the retired schoolteacher who spent her afternoons on the porch with a book. None had any answers. I began leaving water out for her, and when she recognized my scent, she allowed me to sit a few feet away. I noticed the rawness of her paws, the open cuts. Her fur bore new scratches each day, suggesting she might be wandering through brambles or old fences. Every time she finished for the day, she lay down at the edge of that hole and whined softly, as if grieving something invisible. Then she would vanish into the twilight. It was on the 10th day that I finally decided to follow her. Guilt tugged at me, like I was intruding upon her privacy, but my concern overshadowed everything else. That evening, after she stopped digging, I waited until she loped off with that exhausted gait. I kept a respectful distance, so she wouldn't feel threatened. She wound through side streets, cut across an abandoned lot overrun with weeds, and continued around the back of a boarded-up house. My heart squeezed as I recognized the property, an old two-story building that had burned down 2 years earlier in a tragic fire. Rumor had it that an elderly woman had perished in that blaze, unable to escape the flames. The structure, blackened and skeletal, looked haunted against the dim sky. A wave of pity hit me as I watched the dog slip under what remained of a broken fence. I followed her into the charred backyard. Amid the half-collapsed beams and soot-stained debris, she found a small corner of relative safety, sheltered by a toppled oak. There, she curled up on a threadbare blanket that had once been a pastel pink. Torn in places, stained with soot and dirt, it looked like it might have been a cherished quilt. I crouched behind a scorched beam, feeling an ache bloom in my chest as I saw her nose gently nudge the edge of the blanket. She whimpered softly and settled in. That was her bed, her home in the ruin. Something stirred in me, an uneasy feeling that this place held deeper significance, that perhaps the dog had once lived here with someone. A memory flickered. The woman who died in that fire had been known for taking in strays. Locals said she never turned away a homeless animal. Could it be that this golden retriever belonged to her? The possibility nearly stole the breath from my lungs. If so, the dog had lost not just a home, but the only human who ever truly cared for her. And now she was alone, except for that frantic digging each day. I went home, tears burning the back of my eyes, and spent a sleepless night haunted by the dog's desperation. The next morning, I arrived earlier than usual, half expecting to see her already at her spot. But the dusty patch of dirt was empty. Unsure what else to do, I stood there for nearly an hour until at last she appeared, limping slightly, muzzle bowed. She gave me a glance that radiated fatigue and sorrow, then trudged to the hole, resuming her daily routine. The sound of her nails scraping the ground made my skin prickle. I could hardly bear it anymore. That afternoon, I decided to gently investigate the hole after she left. I waited until I was certain she was gone, then knelt at the edge. It was deeper than I expected, nearly up to my waist. The sides were crumbly, and the earth smelled of old roots and damp clay. My stomach flipped as I considered the possibility of unearthing something grisly, but my curiosity was unstoppable. I ran my fingers through the loose soil. At first, I found nothing but rocks and bits of broken glass. Then my hand brushed something soft, a scrap of fabric dark and stained. My heart lurched. I extracted it carefully, my fingers trembling. It was an old piece of cloth, maybe from a shirt or a blanket, shredded beyond recognition. It didn't tell me much, but a faint scent clung to it, a scent of ash and something heartbreakingly familiar like old lavender. Over the next week, the hole got wider and more oddities emerged. A rusted key, a single baby shoe, a broken porcelain figurine. Each item, when I held it, felt charged with significance, as though they were fragments of someone's lost life. And all the while, the dog watched me with wary eyes, never interfering but never retreating either. It was as if she was silently begging me to understand, To see what she was trying to do, sleep became elusive. I'd toss and turn, plagued by dreams of the dog digging in endless fields of ash, trying desperately to unearth something. In these dreams, I sensed it was something intangible, an old promise, a final goodbye. The images left me shaken. The next morning, I arrived with fresh food, water, and antibiotic ointment for her paws. She allowed me to dab her wounds, though she flinched when I touched them. Afterward, she pressed her wet nose against my hand as if in gratitude, then went right back to her labor. The local rumor mill exploded. Some believed the dog was searching for lost treasure hidden during the fire, though no one knew of any treasure in that old house. Others insisted the dog was burying her sorrow, quite literally, day by day. Yet others thought the dog was deranged, that she might have brain damage or be acting out some strange instinct. A few even suggested putting her down to end what they saw as needless suffering. Horrified, I argued against it vehemently. The look in her eyes told me she wasn't insane. She was heartbroken, carrying a weight that no living creature should bear alone. I vowed to protect her. Summer wore on, the heat intensifying. Grass turned brittle. The leaves on the sycamore trees shriveled under the sun's wrath. But the dog never stopped. Each day she dug for hours, exhausted herself, then returned to that scorched backyard. Some nights I'd slip by and leave an extra blanket or some treats. Once, I found her curled around a small, tattered plush bear, its fur blackened by soot. She guarded it with her chin, as though it were the most precious thing in the world. The memory of it made me cry more than once, imagining what it could mean. A child's toy left behind in the ashes. It was around this time that a stranger arrived in town. He was tall, with sun-leathered skin and a distant look in his eyes, the kind of gaze you see in someone who's lived through unspeakable grief. He asked around about a dog, a golden retriever that used to belong to someone named. The name sparked a chord of recognition. That was the name of the woman who had died in the fire. My heart thumped uncomfortably as I introduced myself and explained what I knew. The man, whose name was, revealed a heartbreaking story. Was his grandmother. She'd taken him in for a time when he was a child, and she had a golden retriever named Honey who was pregnant back then. One day, his mother had taken him away under difficult circumstances, but he never forgot the warmth and kindness of that old house. Now, years later, he'd learned of the fire. He'd also heard rumors of a dog that might be Honey, or one of her offspring, still roaming the property. My knees felt weak at the realization that the dog, all this time, might be searching for something connected to his final moments. And I headed to the site together. When the dog spotted him, she froze, ears pricked, tail low. He approached slowly, murmuring, "Honey, is that you?" The dog lowered her head, sniffed the air cautiously, then edged toward him as if something about his scent awakened an old memory. Her tail gave one tentative wag, knelt, tears rolling down his cheeks, and gently stroked her ears. They stayed like that for a long time, two souls bound by the memory of the same lost woman. Before I could ask, explained that's greatest fear was dying alone. He also mentioned the day he left. Honey had just had puppies, 5 tiny, wriggling bundles. But with the passing of time, he knew little about what had happened to those puppies or how life unfolded in its final years. When he heard about the fire, he was consumed by guilt for not returning sooner. The dog, if she was indeed Honey, had outlived her entire litter, or so he assumed. Yet here she was, digging a hole each day in the same patch of ground. Why there? Why now? We waited for her to start digging that day. Observed quietly, tears glistening in his eyes at the raw devotion in her every movement. Then, with steady compassion, he knelt beside her. She paused, looked at him, and let out a heart-wrenching whine. Carefully, he began helping her push aside the dirt. It was painful to watch, two creatures, man and dog, laboring side by side under the scorching sun, compelled by a love for someone they lost. When we finally decided to excavate more thoroughly, we uncovered fragments of an old wooden box, half rotten from years underground. Inside were more remnants, A charred photograph, a string of faded beads, the scorched corner of what looked like a birth certificate, and the half-melted remains of a metal locket. The photograph was nearly unrecognizable, but from the shape of the silhouettes, it looked like standing with a younger woman, possibly his mother, and a little boy. My stomach clenched. The emotional weight in the air was suffocating. Honey stared at the items, her muzzle trembling. Gently picked up the locket, wiping away dirt to reveal an inscription, "Never alone." We looked at each other, speechless. Tears began to blur my vision. This was no random digging. Honey had been trying day after day to reach these memories, to unearth a piece of her past that had been buried, literally and figuratively. Every time she came here, she was fighting to reclaim that bond with the family that once was, trying to say she remembered, that she refused to let the story end in ashes. Held the locket close, sobbing in quiet gasps. Honey pressed her head against his arm, as if consoling him. Even the onlookers who'd gathered were openly weeping now. There was something about the sight of a dog so fiercely loyal, so unwilling to let her loved ones be forgotten, that shook us to our core. But the story didn't end there. That evening, while tidying up the debris, we found something else, a small tin box, rusted at the edges. Inside was a letter in surprisingly good condition, sealed inside a plastic bag. We carefully unfolded it. The handwriting was elegant, looping cursive, and though parts were smeared, we could still make out entire sections. It was addressed to "My dearest grandson. If you find this, know I never stopped loving you. I always hoped you'd return to this house one day. I wanted to leave something of myself behind, a small treasure of memories, so you'd know you were never alone in this world. Please remember the joy we shared. If Honey still lives, she will guide you. She's a faithful soul who never gave up on anyone she loved. Love always, Grandma." By the time we finished reading, was trembling, barely able to hold the letter. Honey leaned against him, whining softly. I felt tears burn trails down my cheeks. It was as if spirit lingered, guiding Honey to dig until someone found that letter, that final message of unwavering love. Word spread quickly about the discovery. The next day, half the town showed up to see the letter and the other items, an impromptu vigil forming around the charred remains of his home. Neighbors brought flowers, placing them in the yard like a memorial. Someone set out candles at dusk, and their soft glow lit the haunted skeleton of the house. Honey sat quietly at side, not digging for once. It was as though her mission was complete. People wept openly, hugging one another, marveling at the power of a dog's devotion. That night I saw a single star blaze across the sky, a fleeting comet. Maybe it was just coincidence, but it felt like a cosmic nod to the moment. Yet heartbreak has many layers. A few days later, we noticed Honey was limping more severely. She seemed weaker, her daily routine of digging replaced by long, exhausted naps. Her appetite waned. Took her to the local vet, who discovered advanced health issues, liver failure, possibly cancer. The vet explained gently that Honey didn't have long, that her body was succumbing to years of hardship. The news hit us like a punch to the gut. After everything she'd done, after unearthing that final legacy of love, fate was now closing in on her. We brought Honey to stay with me, where I prepared a soft bed and made sure she was never alone. Spent every possible moment at her side, stroking her fur, telling her stories about the grandmother he remembered. Honey responded with gentle licks, her eyes filled with an indescribable warmth. I tried to coax her to eat with homemade broth, but each day her strength slipped away just a bit more. Still, there was a profound peace about her, as though she'd fulfilled her life's purpose. She had guided back to memory, ensuring that no one would forget the love that once thrived under that roof. When the end finally came, it was both swift and devastating. Honey closed her eyes one evening, breathing shallowly, his hand resting gently on her head. She let out one final sigh, her chest rising and falling. Then stillness. A silence so complete it felt like the air had been sucked from the room. We sat there, tears streaming down our faces, clinging to her soft fur. As the reality of her passing set in, an overwhelming sense of awe mingled with the sorrow. She had waited just long enough for to arrive, just long enough to ensure love found its way back into the light. The funeral, if one could call it that, took place in the same plot of earth where Honey had dug all those days. The hole was still there, wide and deep, her labor of love. A gentle summer breeze rustled the wild grass as we laid her to rest. Everyone in town who had witnessed her devotion showed up. Flowers and wreaths decorated the makeshift grave, wrapped the tattered red around a small wooden cross that bore Honey's name. I read the letter aloud, voice shaking, reminding everyone that the love we share can transcend even the deepest darkness. In the days that followed, we raised funds to clear the remains of the burned house. In its place, we built a small memorial garden. We planted a flowering dogwood tree, its blossoms a vibrant reminder of life's cyclical beauty. Beneath its shade, we placed a stone plaque dedicated to both and Honey. It bore parting words, "Never alone." The transformation in the town was subtle yet profound. The petty gossip that had once fueled our days now gave way to gentler conversations, stories of loved ones long gone, acts of kindness between neighbors, an unspoken pledge that we would not let each other suffer in silence. Honey's story spread beyond our borders, traveling by word of mouth, eventually circulating online. People from distant places wrote letters or emails, moved by the image of a dog digging every day for a reason no one could initially understand. They, too, saw a reflection of heartbreak and devotion that transcended human comprehension. Relieved of the crushing guilt he'd carried for years, decided to stay in town. He used his savings to help fund a small animal shelter, naming it Honey's Haven. Its mission was simple: to provide a safe place for strays, to ensure that no animal would roam the streets, lost and desperate, in search of a love that might never return. Volunteers poured in, young people, retirees, families who'd read Honey's story. They donated blankets, food, medicine. Over time, the shelter became a beacon of hope for both animals and the people who cared for them. Meanwhile, I found myself changed. Before meeting Honey, I was often caught up in my own routines and anxieties, rarely looking beyond my small sphere. But her daily ritual of digging for something intangible shook me awake. She taught me that heartbreak can be a kind of compass, guiding us, urging us to seek resolution, to honor the love we've lost rather than let it vanish. She showed me that some bonds transcend speech, reason, and even death. From that point on, I vowed to pay attention to the silent stories around me, the quiet cries for help that often go unheard in the bustle of life. Sometimes, late at night, I'd visit the memorial garden, sitting under the young dogwood tree. I like to imagine Honey sprinting through an endless field somewhere, free from pain, her golden fur shining in the sun. Maybe was there too, smiling as she waited with open arms. The thought offered a tender sort of comfort, one that lingered long after I left. Months rolled by, turning into a year. The dogwood tree began to bloom in earnest, its white and pink petals luminous in the spring light. People still came by to place small offerings, a stuffed toy, a handwritten note, a bouquet of wildflowers. Children played among the benches, sometimes pausing to trace the words on the plaque. Life continued its steady rhythm, but Honey's impact never faded. Each time I passed the garden, I felt a surge of gratitude and awe for the dog whose broken heart had led us to uncover love's enduring power. Now at peace with his grandmother's memory, found a new purpose. He helped a young mother with groceries, volunteered at the local school, and spent countless hours at Honey's Haven. Sometimes, I'd catch him sitting by Honey's grave late in the evening, reading aloud from a book or simply talking as though she were still by his side. His voice carried on the breeze, soothing and sincere. I suspect it was as healing for him as it was a tribute to her. A few skeptics remained in the world at large, people who rolled their eyes at stories of dogs performing miracles of love. But anyone who'd looked into Honey's eyes, who'd seen her day after day digging that hole with a resolve that reason knew better. We witnessed the unstoppable force of devotion firsthand. As for me, I found myself forever changed by the realization that heartbreak can be a catalyst for transformation. Honey taught me that when sorrow carves a hole in our hearts, it can create space for something new, empathy, understanding, and a deeper connection to one another. On the first anniversary of Honey's passing, the town organized a candlelight gathering. Men, women, and children stood in a circle around the dogwood tree, each holding a candle that flickered in the cool twilight. Stepped forward, clearing his throat, and read aloud's letter once more. His voice was stronger this time, though still laced with emotion. When he finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. We shared stories of how Honey's devotion had touched us, of small acts of kindness we'd done since then, inspired by her memory. In the hush that followed, a soft breeze rustled the leaves, causing the candles to flicker in unison. It felt as though Honey's spirit and too was passing among us, acknowledging our vigil. Life being life, new challenges arose in town. Budget cuts threatened the school. A fierce storm tore through the outskirts, damaging several homes. Yet time and again, people came together to help, forging a bond that even adversity could not shatter. Honey's story became part of our collective tapestry, reminding us that sometimes the simplest acts, like digging in the dirt day after day, can unveil a profound truth about the human and canine capacity for loyalty and love. Even now, I sometimes pass by that patch of earth that Honey tore at so relentlessly. The grass has, lush and green, a gentle sign that nature heals itself in time. Yet I swear, if I close my eyes, I can still hear the scraping of her paws, sense the fierce determination in her panting breaths. I remember how each hole she dug brought us one step closer to understanding her heartbreak, and ultimately our own. There are days when I think about what might have happened if no one had paid attention, if we'd simply dismissed her as a deranged stray. The thought chills me. It makes me grateful that we choose compassion over indifference. Because in the end, compassion turned heartbreak into a call to action, forging connections among neighbors who might never have met, prompting a grandson to finally heal, and inspiring a small town to become a haven for every living thing in need. A few times a year, makes the trip back to where his mother now lives, carrying the letter and locket as treasured keepsakes. He's reconnected with her after many years of strained distance. The process isn't easy, time and trauma have their scars, but they're rebuilding a relationship day by day. He told me that whenever things get tough, he thinks of Honey's unwavering persistence, how she never quit, never lost hope that someone would finally see what she was doing. That thought bolsters him, gives him the courage to forgive and to try again. In a way, it feels like the entire town is living proof that tragedy can lead to renewal. The charred remains of his house have long been cleared away. The memorial garden now brims with colorful blooms, zinnias, marigolds, snapdragons, that burst to life each spring. The dogwood tree stands at the center, symbolic of Honey's faithful heart, its branches open wide, providing shade for anyone who seeks it. Birds nest in its upper limbs and squirrels scamper around its trunk. Sometimes, children gather under it with a soccer ball or a jump rope, their laughter echoing through the warm evening air. To think that it all started with a single, determined dog who wouldn't let go of her heartbreak until she turned it into something meaningful. Sometimes, a new traveler or tourist passing through town will hear whispers of the story. They come to the garden, stand in silence and read the plaque. You can see the wonder in their eyes, the little shake of their heads, maybe a tear or two if they're especially tender-hearted. Then they leave, carrying that story with them. And I like to imagine that somewhere else in the world, they find another lost or hurting creature, remember Honey's tale, and choose kindness in her honor. I'm certain that if there's an afterlife, Honey is there with, lying on a porch somewhere warm and bright. Maybe is knitting in a rocking chair, occasionally dropping a hand to scratch Honey behind the ears. Maybe they're surrounded by loved ones who passed on, including Honey's litter of puppies, all wagging their tails in perfect unison. Maybe they glance down from time to time, proud of how we've carried on, grateful we remembered them not just in sorrow but in love. That final image is what stays with me. A golden retriever who refused to let heartbreak fade into obscurity, who dug and dug at the earth until she unearthed the memories that bound a family together. At first, we thought we were witnessing madness. In truth, we were witnessing a love so strong it transcended words, a dog's devotion that bridged the gap between life and death. And that love, that heartbreak, changed us all. When I reflect on it now, I understand the reason Honey dug that hole every day is both simple and infinitely profound. She needed to bring back the pieces of a love that had been buried, to show the world what it means to hold on when everything else has turned to ash. In the process, she reminded us how to be human, how to care, how to grieve, and ultimately how to heal. It's a reason that may well be the saddest and most beautiful I've ever known. And in a strange, breathtaking way, I think that reason will echo across every heart that hears her story.